We're at Chof Beis, chapter Chof, Pasuk Chof Beis. Prior to this, Moshe sent a messenger to the king of Edom and asked that he should be able to pass through his land. And he would not allow him. So they back off and they travel. V'yisu mikodesh. It would have been the most direct route into Canaan, but Yisu mikodesh. They traveled from Kodesh because they weren't able to go take that direct route through the Edomite territory. V'yovid Yisrael kol ida hor. The complete congregation came to Hor. So Rashi explains, who is this kol ida? Kulam shleimim v'omdim likonis loretz. They're all complete and ready to enter into the land. There wasn't one of the people who the decree was upon them they should die before entry. That generation died off. Those who were meant to die in the desert died. And this group is the group that it says regarding them, they're able to live and cleave to Hashem at this point going forward. They're qualified to go into Eretz Yisrael. What's Hor? Har al gabi har, ki tefuach kodon al gabi tapuach godel. It's like one apple on top of another apple. One mound on top of another mound. Tefuach means swollen, meaning a double-tiered mountain. Now, I addressed this yesterday. Although the cloud would travel before them and level or compress the mountains, there were 3 mountains that were left in the desert. Because the Onon, the cloud that traveled for them, compressed all the mountains in the Midbar, in the desert. What were the 3 mountains that remained? Har Sinai, the Torah. Har Sinai, the Torah, that mountain was not compressed. Har Nevo, Likfuras Moshe. Mount Nevo, that was where Moshe Rabbeinu was buried. V'Har Hor, Likfuras Aaron. And this mountain, this double-tiered mountain, which is called Hor, a mountain on top of a mountain, that was left intact, so Aaron should be buried there. So yesterday I brought up a question. Seemingly, the cloud only leveled the mountains and compressed the mountains that were in their route, in that direction they were traveling. What about the mountains that are off to the right or to the left, which they wouldn't have encountered as being in their way? Those mountains were not compressed. That's why I always understood it. From Rashi, it seems to be all the mountains in the desert, other than Sinai, Nevo, and Har, those were the only 3 mountains were not compressed. The question is, I said if it was in their way, they had to be compressed. But if it was off to the side, why should they be compressed? But it seems to me all the mountains in the desert were actually no longer existent because the cloud compressed them. Why? That's the question I asked yesterday. So I said something interesting. First time I ever said it. The Gemara says in Bava Basra that if you have a Jewish community, any of the structures in the community are not permitted to be built higher than the Beis HaKnesset and Beis HaMedrash. Why? Because the zenith of value, of specialness, has to be the shul, the Beis HaKnesset, or the Beis HaMedrash, the Torah study hall. So having a structure higher than that would be a disrespect. However, it's cited in Halacha that since we live among Gentiles and there are other structures, such as the church, in Europe, the church was always the highest structure in the community. That's why you have these towers and these spires because whatever we have, they took from us. What is the focal point of a community? The house of worship. And it was always the highest structure. So once the church or other structures built by the non-Jews are higher than the shul or the Beis HaMedrash, there's no permission for the Jew to build their structure, even ordinary structure, higher than the shul, because there are other structures in the community that are built by the non-Jews that are higher than the shul and the Beis HaMedrash. And that's halacha. So if you'd have a new community in Eretz Yisrael being built, wherever it may be, and it's a total Jewish community, none of the buildings can be higher than the Beis HaKnesses or the Beis HaMedrash. It will be a disrespect. So now, why did Hashem choose Sinai over all the mountains to give the Torah? So it says explicitly in Chazal, because Sinai was the smallest of the mountains. And every mountain came to Hashem and said, give the Torah on me. Sinai believed it didn't have a chance. So the spiritual entity which represents Sinai comes to Hashem, doesn't even bother putting in its bid for the right to have Torah to be given on the mountain. Because such a small mountain, it's not worthy. So due to the humility of the mountain, Hashem chose Sinai over all the other mountains to give the Torah on Sinai. Because humility is a prerequisite for the Torah itself. And Sinai, being the smallest of the mountains, represents humility. Okay? This is a Chazal. Now, once Sinai was chosen to be the location of Torah, you realize now we have a problem with every other mountain. Every other mountain that was larger than Sinai cannot be higher than Sinai. Because since Sinai is the focal point of everything, because Hashem gave the Torah on Sinai, once it takes on that value, you can have no other mountain higher than Sinai. As a result of that, all the mountains, even the mountains in the desert that did not would block their route of travel, they were all compressed because Sinai had to be the ultimate mountain. So the question is, so why Har Nevo and Hor Hor? And that Chazal answer, Rashi cites the Midrash, because Har Nevo it was the burial location of Moshe Rabbeinu, and Hor Hor was the burial location of Aaron. So again, these mountains represent exactly what the Torah is all about. Har Nevo is Torah Tziv Lo to Moshe, Moshe Kilas Yaakov. The source of Torah is Moshe Rabbeinu. He was the transmitter of the word of Hashem to Klal Yisrael. Therefore, that mountain was not compressive because it would not be contradictory to what Sinai represents. And Aaron, being the counterpart of Moshe Rabbeinu, since we needed it for his burial, the Hor HaHor, therefore that mountain wasn't compressed either. That's what I explained yesterday. But what I pointed out yesterday, it says, and where was the mountain located? Al Gvul Eretz Edom Lemor. It was on the border of Edom. So Rashi himself says, why is it important for us to know where Hor HaHor is located? That it was on the border of the land of Edom. So Rashi explains, Magid Shemnei Shedischabru Kan Liskarev Leisav Arosha. Because they were at the border of Edom, and Moshe Rabbeinu asked, could they get passage through the land? And they were denied passage. But because they became close, proximity-wise, to Esav the Rasha, Nifetzu Maseim V'chosru Atzadik Hazer. Therefore, their actions were breached, and therefore Aaron was taken, because their actions were breached. The Navi says to Yehoshaphat, who was the king of Yehuda, who was a tzaddik, because of your level of attachment and association with Chazio, parts Hashem's Masecha. Hashem breached your actions. What is this all about? If the Jews would have sinned as a result of being in the proximity of Esav, we understand. We find the Jews themselves, spiritually speaking, there was no change. But because of the level of association, the Esav HaRasha, their actions were considered breached. Question is why? That's the question we asked in the past. So, what I had said was, there's a very beautiful word from the Chofetz Chaim. You know, the Torah tells us, B'shalem l'sorov al panav lavido. People are truly evil. God pays their reward in this world. So when they pass away, when they die, they go into the oblivion because they were fully paid off for any good deed they did in their lifetime. That's Mishalim Alponov Lavido. God pays his enemies in their presence when they're alive, Lavido, to send them off into oblivion to destroy them. They should have no share in the world to come. That's a posuk. So, what is their share? If Chazal tell us in Pirkei Avos, Schar B'Hayel Meleko, that a mitzvah is so infinitely valuable, you cannot be paid off in this world for a mitzvah. But the Rasha, being the Rasha, he has no interest in the world to come. And God doesn't want him in the world to come because there's no relationship. Therefore, Hashem pays him the reward of this world. So what does he have? So what does he have to? What does he have to be compensated for? Something that, under normal circumstances, the reward is eternity. So how do you take eternity, and compress it into 70 years? How do you do it? You know how you do it. The man is number 3 in Forbes. He lives in the mansion. He has multiple homes. He has a Rolls Royce for every day of the week. He has enough money, he doesn't know what to do with it. He gets all the glory. That's Mishal, the son of Ponav Lavido. He's being paid off for his good deeds in his lifetime, Lavido, that he should be destroyed. He should go into the oblivion. So the Chofetz Chaim writes, a person sees a person living at this level of wealth, opulence, and material, people are envious, right? They would also like to have that kind of quality life, material-wise, knowledge-wise, everything-wise. Chofetz Chaim explains it with a mashal, beautiful allegory. He says there was this minister who actually acted disrespectfully to the king, and the king wanted to give him a due punishment. So what did he do? He gave an order that a palace should be built, a replica of his own palace, with all the furnishings identical to his palace. However, they should put windows in all sides of the palace from floor to ceiling that everyone is able to actually look in from the outside into the inside of the palace. And the tailor of the king should tailor regal garments for this minister to wear when he will be in this palace, because nothing is less fitting unless he wears regal garments in this palace. Okay? Finally, it's finished. The minister is condemned. However, the minister has to remain in his palace. He can never leave this palace. People see the minister, which is a commoner, going into this palace. They're dripping from envy. You know, why did he merit to have such a lifestyle, to live like a king, although he's a commoner? However, nobody knew that the king said he will go into the palace, but he will not have food and he will not have water. He will live in that palace, confined, locked in there, not that food or water. But nobody knew that. And they see him going in with his regal garments, with the king's coach being dropped off, goes in, being escorted. They lock the door, and he's sitting. He has all the reading material, and he's walking around as if he's the king. A few days pass. He's not drinking, he's not eating, but everybody's able to look in from the outside in to see what his situation is. And after about 2-3 days, he takes on like a very pale look, a sickly look. A week passes. He has not food or drink. He's starting to look haggard. A week and a half passes. He starts drinking his own urine, and he starts tearing pieces of flesh out of his hand to sustain himself. After a few weeks pass, he was tearing flesh off his body, and that was sustaining him. He looked grotesque. He looked disastrous. At this point, people understood what exactly the punishment was. That he's literally living by eating his own flesh. That's how he's maintaining himself. He's tearing flesh from his own body to maintain his existence. So the Chofetz Chaim writes that the person who's paid off in this world with the mansions and the opulence and the status and the acknowledgement and the cars, whatever he has, he's eating his own flesh in this world. What he's eating is his eternity. It's worse than eating his own flesh. If people would only realize what he's giving up for what, there wouldn't be any envy. That's what Chofetz Chaim writes. So therefore, as a result of this, what condemning that king to go, this minister going to the palace, is the ultimate of Midas Adin. That is the attribute of justice. Although surface-wise it looks like it's the ultimate, but because nobody knows what's being given up for that, therefore that's the ultimate attribute of justice. That's the Chofetz Chaim over there. So what I said was this. Who is Esav? Who is Yaakov? Esav is epitomizes and personifies material, power, wealth, leadership, everything in the material sense. Yaakov is Ishtami Yeshiva Olim. He's the perfect man who sits in the tent, studies Torah, committed to spirituality, and the physicality, material, its values all to facilitate the spiritual. That's his only value. But Esav lives high on the hog, because that's his portion in life. That's Esav. And Esav's position is Esav Soni Yaakov. Esav hates Yaakov. He's the counterbalance to Kedusha. Now, when you go in the proximity of Esav, what is the valuation of that region? Is that Midas Harachim, Midas Adin? That's Midas Adin. Because whatever Esav has, it's an exchange for his world to come. So that evaluation there for Esav is really Midas Adin. So if the Jews being in that region, in that location, what is the evaluation if you're there? The valuation is Midas Adin. What's Midas Adin for a Jew? Midas Adin for a Jew is not exchanging his Olam Haba for Olam Hazeh, exchanging the world to come for the material world. That's not Midas Adin for a Jew. Midas Adin for a Jew is that we pay our actions are not perfect enough, and therefore we're punished. As we understand what Midas Adin is, it's not to pay us off in this world to go into the oblivion, but rather God doesn't want us to go into oblivion. So therefore, but because the evaluation is so exacting, which is Midas Adin, therefore, when we were elsewhere, our actions were acceptable, were even considered exemplary. But the moment you go into a region where it's Midas Adin, as Chazal tell us, Midas Adin does the friendship with Tzaddik and Rosha. Because you cannot be perfect enough when you're under the guise of Midas Adin, and therefore the actions become breached. So that's what it says, because we're in this Chaber, Le'esav HaRosha, when we're associated to Esav HaRosha in that region. What is the evaluation system? What is the yardstick? It's an exacting yardstick. That's the scale of evaluation. Therefore, Nifrutzu Maseim, their actions became breached because now all the shortcomings and deficiencies are obvious in that action. Therefore, you're not accredited for the action. Not only you're not accredited, you're condemned for it because it's not perfect enough. Therefore, Therefore, Hashem took Aaron at this point to silence the Midas Adin against Klal Yisrael, and that's why Aaron at this moment passed away. And he cites, as we find the Navi said to Yoshaphat, that because of your level of attachment to Chazio, who is an evil man, parts Hashem is Masecha. Hashem breached your actions. Now he sees your actions as breached. They're no longer as perfect as they normally would be seen. We find that when the Malachim came, the angels came to Sodom to save Lot on behalf of, in the merit of Avram Avinu, so they told him to go to a certain location. So he said to the angels, he says, I'm afraid to go. Why? Because he says, when I was in Sodom, although I'm far from perfect, but on a bell curve, relative to what they are, I was a tzaddik. But now that I'm in the proximity of Avram Avinu, how am I going to be valued? I'm seen as a Russia. Therefore, I will not survive it. There'll be a level of divine prosecution against me. Let me go to another location. And the Malachim allowed him to go to the other location. But why was Lot concerned if he'd be in the proximity of Avram Avinu? Because if he's in the proximity of Avram Avinu, how is he seen? He's seen as Russia, not as tzaddik. Because In Avram Avinu, everything is relative to where you are. And Azot, the Malachim, they allowed him to go, and therefore he was able to survive the destruction of Sodom.